Hey everybody, welcome back. Another video for you. As always, so much to discuss. No way I'll be able to put it all into a short video. Go to the Patreon page, patreon.com/Eric Draitzer. You'll find a lot more videos there, all kinds of information analysis. Obviously, in the last 10 days, the pace has been picking up because the pace of world events has been picking up. And who knows where we'll be a week or two or three from now. So if you appreciate this analysis that I try to be as objective and honest and sticking to the facts as possible, then please do support the work. It's greatly appreciated. Okay, let's talk about what's going on today. I have a lot to cover, but what I am going to do instead of talking about the day's developments here on March 6th, it is 8 p.m. on the East Coast of the United States. What I'd like to do is I'd like to address an important subject that I think really sort of underscores a lot of the discourse around Ukraine and around this war. And that has to do with the nature of the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian state. And what I mean is being able to separate out what is true, what is not, what is real, what is Kremlin propaganda, what is NATO propaganda, and what is the reality. Being able to figure this out is very, very difficult because, as I've said many times, this conflict is in many ways a disinformation war. There is disinformation and misinformation coming very fast from all sides, and it makes it really difficult and, in some ways, somewhat disorienting. And so, what I'd like to do is just address what I think is an extremely simplistic and only marginally true interpretation of Ukraine and the Ukrainian state. And it really, I think, aligns with much of the Kremlin propaganda. And when you can cut through that, you have a much better understanding of what this war is actually about. So, if you are to take the Kremlin line, the straightforward Kremlin propaganda line, and you can find it if you're a left winger and you're on Twitter, you can find all kinds of absolute idiots spouting this because they don't know anything about anything and they pretend that they do because they picked up one or two talking points here or there. Their narrative will say that in 2014, the democratically elected government of Yanukovych was overthrown by what amounts to a US backed CIA coup carried out by Nazis that put in its place more or less a Nazi EU Nazi government, and that government waged a genocidal war against Donbass for 8 years, trying to eradicate the Russian-speaking people of the East and essentially exercise dominion over the Donetsk, Lugansk People's Republics. More or less, that then leads you to apologia for Putin, because in this narrative, in this upside down analysis, Putin and Russia are essentially acting defensively. They are essentially protecting the victims of the conflict, right? It's straightforward Kremlin talking points. It aligns absolutely directly with what they've been saying about their special military operation, right? So, and there are leftists out there, many of whom are genuine, who believe that they are spouting what they believe to be the true anti fascist interpretation, the anti fascist line. But the truth is, it's bogus. Okay. It's put out there to a large extent, manipulated and distorted by the Kremlin with only vague elements of truth, some remnants of actual history, and mostly distortions and misinformation. So let's go through the actual situation. And I will just say, I am by no means an expert on all of the nuances of Ukrainian politics. There are plenty of people in Ukraine who can provide much more detailed analysis of all of these things. But I think it's important that for those of us in the United States and in the West to have at least a basic understanding of what the contours of this conflict are, the real contours of the conflict, because it ain't no denazification mission. I can assure you of that. So, what we really are looking at is a war that is, in fact, a war between oligarchs, an oligarch block war. Okay. Essentially, you have, if you look at it just from, and leaving aside the Russian oligarchs for a second, just from the Ukrainian perspective, you could see that up until 2014, when there was that Maidan uprising and all of those events that led to the frozen conflict in the East, you could roughly break the oligarchs into two camps, a pro-Maidan and an anti-Maidan camp. The pro-Maidan camp, of course, saw its future with the European Union, wanted to more closely associate with the West. The anti-Maidan obviously wanted to associate more closely with Russia. And it breaks down along these lines within the elite class of oligarchs. So, and I just want to say, I'm not going to touch on every single oligarch in Ukraine. I don't have time for that. And I'm not sure if everybody be able to keep all the names straight. I don't know if I could. But I am going to touch on what I think are some of the most critical ones and the ones that are in some ways very instrumental to what's going on today. So in the pro-Maidan camp, you had Petro Poroshenko, who soon after that becomes the next president of Ukraine after the sort of caretaker government and official elections. Poroshenko becomes the president of Ukraine. Poroshenko is a billionaire, mostly from his confectionery empire, though he also owns, I believe, at least one TV channel, Channel 5, in Ukraine. And I think he also has some other media properties as well. He's a billionaire. He's an oligarch. He becomes the president. And what happens is, well, before I get into Poroshenko's presidency, let me just say that Poroshenko is joined in what you might call the pro-Maidan oligarch camp at this time with Ihor Kolomoisky. Kolomoisky, infamous for many reasons, including the fact that he was the one who controlled the privatized bank of Ukraine, so-called Privat Bank or private bank. And I'm going to get into what happened with that in a second. But Kolomoisky owned banks, oil and gas interests, media properties, and many other things. Among those things, Kolomoisky absolutely has employed various militias at various times, including some on the far right, which is where you get this bizarre interplay between a Jewish oligarch and far right wing militias, sometimes even neo Nazi militias, right? And you would think it's just this absolutely unfathomable mix, and yet it happens. And the reason for that is not because Kolomoisky is a Nazi or anything ideological. It is because these are criminal gangs. These are gangs. These are muscle that can be used, that can enforce the will of their employer on the streets or what have you. There are very, very practical reasons why these groups, these militias or gangs or whatever you want to call them, are used, and they're utilized by all sides in this conflict. And that's what we have to understand. And not only the Nazis in Ukraine, but the Nazis from Russia that streamed over the border into Ukraine in 2014 to fight against the anti-Russian Nazis. So anyway, before I digress, Kolomoisky does have some connections, tenuous though they may be, with some of these elements, but more specifically, Kolomoisky's connection is with Zelensky. And I'm going to get to why that's important here in a second. Now, this is where the Kremlin will ultimately and every time attempt to distort the reality of Ukraine's politics. They would say essentially that the oligarchs have no distinctions among them and that they essentially more or less are subject to the will of Nazis, which is, of course, completely absurd. Um, Now, let me just say that very quickly, when Poroshenko was the president, Poroshenko actually fought back against the Russian forces in Donetsk and Lugansk. That's what led to the ultimate confrontation where Putin had to send in the special forces and some of the elite soldiers and essentially make that a frozen conflict. One of the reasons why Poroshenko was never forgiven by Moscow and why they never even wanted to make any attempts with Poroshenko was because he pushed back in the East. Now, this is not to say that Poroshenko is a great guy. This is to say that Moscow didn't control all of these dynamics, and that's important. So now in the pro-Maidan camp, you have, and of course, we should also mention Yulia Tymoshenko, who also had been president at one point, the gas princess with her interests in petroleum products, etc. Now, this Kolomoisky, Poroshenko, Tymoshenko faction was pro-Maidan. The anti-Maidan faction, the more Moscow-aligned, would be typified by oligarchs like Rinat Akhmetov. Akhmetov is probably most famous in Donetsk as the owner of the Donetsk Football Club, but he's also a multi-billionaire who has a coal mining empire, interests in minerals all throughout the Donbass. He also owns telecom companies, media properties, industrial concerns, and so forth. He is one of the most powerful people in Eastern Europe, one of the wealthiest, and for a long time, even up through 2014, very much seen as aligned with Moscow. Similarly, you also had in the anti-Maidan camp Dmitry Firtash, also billionaire, also very considered close to Moscow. He actually made his billions in controlling the infrastructure, the pipelines, the flow of gas from Russia through Ukraine, skimming off the top, I'm sure, transit fees and so forth. You get the idea. So Firtash is connected to a number of oligarchs, including oligarchs on the other side of the border in Russia, some very powerful ones, including Vasily Anisimov and a number of others who, in various ways, Firtash and others have been responsible for funneling money into some of these new political parties that have emerged in Ukraine. The politics has changed dramatically since 2014. But of course, if you want to listen to the Kremlin propagandists, they'll tell you all you need to know is that back in 2014, there was a coup, guy was overthrown. They're all Nazis. It's cool. They should all die. Don't worry about it. Right? No. What we have are real conflicts and power blocks and divisions and movement between these camps. So in 2014, that's pretty much how they aligned. Now, what happens is you have this major rivalry between Kolomoisky on the one hand and Akhmetov on the other. And these two have been jockeying for power ever since then, and really ever since 2016. In 2016, Kolomoisky was stripped of a lot of his wealth because in Ukraine, under Poroshenko, they passed a law nationalizing the private bank that Kolomoisky owned. And as soon as that happened, the Ukrainian state absorbed a lot of what Kolomoisky had in terms of his, under his control, capital under his control. That, of course, was seen as, a major, major blow to Kolomoisky. I believe this is in 2016. In any event, Kolomoisky seems to fade away. Poroshenko is firmly in power, and then we have an election in 2019. Poroshenko is running for re-election for his second term, and he's running against an actor named Zelensky. And Zelensky is known to be in various ways close to and or directly backed by Kolomoisky. You got it. So here we have right back in the front pages of the Ukrainian political process, Kolomoisky vying for power to come back with Zelensky as his sort of front man, his puppet. That is how it was seen by many, many people in Ukraine. Whether or not that's true is sort of beside the point. That was the interpretation a lot of people had. But here's the thing. What happens when Zelensky comes into power is that he finds himself in the middle of all of these competing interests. And oh, by the way, they desperately need an $8 billion loan from the IMF. And oh, by the way, the IMF makes it conditional that we're not going to provide you that loan or the financing or anything as long as we think that Kolomoisky is back in the picture. And so as soon as he's elected, Zelensky starts moving away from Kolomoisky and a little bit closer to Akhmetov, who 5 years earlier had been seen as being close to Moscow. And here's the other aspect of this that these Twitter geniuses and Kremlin liars are never going to tell you. Things have changed dramatically since 2014. Some of these oligarchs, including Akhmetov, I mean, I don't want to speak to him specifically, but his interests and people like him in that region, they'll never forgive Russia for 2014. They do not accept the idea that Russia acted defensively. Russia has thrown away whatever goodwill it had with a tremendous portion of the Ukrainian people, including those in the Donbass. And they'll never admit it, of course, on Russian media or the various outlets. But the truth is that the vast majority of people in Eastern Ukraine and even in Crimea itself understand that what happened in 2014 was a deliberate dismemberment of Ukraine by Russia piecemeal. Okay, and so you see it in the opinion polls. You can see it in various ways. The people rejected Russia after what Russia did in 2014 and creating that conflict. And that reflects in the oligarchs themselves. Those who had previously been close to Moscow move away. And so Akhmetov, who's already rivaling with Kolomoisky, is now no longer pro-Moscow. He's now pro-Zelensky. And so between Kolomoisky and Akhmetov is a competition for some kind of influence with this new government. Okay. And Zelensky, for his part, has to walk this line between these competing power blocks of oligarchs. And the way that he does that, and the degree to which he is successful in doing that, is really his political career. That is his political survival. And again, I think we have to be very clear about what this is really telling us. It's telling us that the interests in this war are oligarch economic interests primarily. And those are oligarchs in Russia and oligarchs in Ukraine. So, like I said, Akhmetov and Firtash and some of these others, these oligarchs own these resources in Ukraine, the minerals, the energy, all of these things, right? That should belong to the people of Ukraine. They don't. They belong to these oligarchs in Ukraine. But the oligarchs in Russia, along with Putin, of course, they don't see it that way. They don't think that these petty little Ukrainian oligarchs should control these minerals. Those are Russian, and they are historically Russian. It is the Russian Empire that mined for coal in Donbass, et cetera, et cetera. They see the mineral wealth, the resources as belonging to them, belonging to Russia, belonging to their business empires. So, in essence, what you then have is a sort of distortion, a kind of weaponization of certain elements of Ukrainian politics, and then distorting it through this very absurd kind of Russian propaganda prism to make you think that there's a war about Nazis and fascists and an anti Nazi, anti fascist force coming from Russia, when the truth is it's a war for control over resources and minerals and influence and all of these other things, and a war between billionaires. That's what we're really witnessing playing out. And of course, they're on the verge of dragging the entire world down with them. But I make these points to make it very clear that when we're talking about the history, the recent history of this conflict, it is a history of capital, about the flows of capital, about investment, about who controls resources, about the movement of alliances shifting from Moscow to Kiev and so forth. I mean, there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of nuances, but that's what the Russian propaganda side will always want to erase. And that's what the Western propaganda side is always going to try to erase. They want to tell you Zelensky is some, saintly hero, right? Here is, God incarnate who has come, or Saint Michael to, whatever. I don't know. I don't know all these Bible stories, but, to defend Ukraine, the hero, right? The Alexander Nevsky of Ukraine, or whatever it might be, but I mean, Western media is not going to tell you that Zelensky is a product of oligarchs. They're not going to tell you that Zelensky has been balancing the oligarchs and trying to kind of govern by virtue of sort of giving each of them a little piece of what they want, but not everything. They're not going to tell you about the conflict between the oligarchs. They're not going to tell you any of those things, right? If you listen to right wing propaganda, sure, you might hear something about Hunter Biden and Burisma, but that doesn't actually explain anything. It doesn't tell you what it is really about here. Russia's leftist activists and Marxists and stuff, they have a very good understanding of this because they know they're oligarchs. They know what their interests are, and they know how they look at the east of Ukraine and really at Ukraine as a whole. Ukraine belongs to Russia. That is the imperial mindset. And it is not just Ukraine belonging to Russia as a concept. It is its resources. It is its fertile soils. It is its sea access. All of the strategic reasons why Catherine the Great and the czars had consolidated power and fought wars over Ukraine and Crimea and so forth. All of those reasons. Okay, but to understand this conflict as Russia denazifying Ukraine, it's to be an absolute idiot. It's to be a naive sucker. Don't be a sucker. Understand the conflict for what it is. All right. Gonna have to leave it there. It's already 20 minutes. Go over to the Patreon. I'm going to talk about Russia's medium-sized companies running to China to open bank accounts. That's pretty predictable, of course. What does that mean? What does that tell us about the future of Russia's currency, the Chinese currency, and so forth? And then this extremely irresponsible and dangerous and rather terrifying talk of no-fly zones and why this really needs to stop, because I think people need to think about the implications of what they're calling for. But with that being said, I'm all done for tonight. I will leave it there. Thank you all so much. Talk to you again next time.